Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and today I'm going to be carrying on talking about Anthony Powell's amazing series A Dance to the Music of Time, and today I'm going to be talking about Book 8, The Soldier's Art. The Soldier's Art was actually October's book in my read-along. I will link down the Goodreads group, etc. down below. This video will have spoilers, so don't watch it unless you are reading along with the read-along and have read this book. I am a little bit late, I know, but I'm listening to the next book, Book 9, and November's book, The Military Philosophers, at the moment, so hopefully that video will be up fairly soon as well. So as usual, I will quickly go through the plot, and then I will talk about some of the things I like in this book a lot, some of the important and interesting characters in this book, and finally a few of the themes. So this book is again set during the Second World War, and it consists of just 3 chapters, I think, this time. It's one of the shorter ones. In the first chapter, we see Nick as he works for Widmerpool, get a sense of what his working life is like, and also what Widmerpool is like as a person to work with. He's very proud, but doesn't always play by the rules, and sometimes makes enemies and gets himself into trouble. And we also again encounter Charles Stringham, who is working at the place where Nick is stationed as a mess waiter. He is a private, Nick is an officer, and this kind of causes a strain in their relationship and the fact that they used to know each other. Then in the second chapter, Nick goes on leave. He fails a French test for a job he would quite like in a different part of the army, which would be quite interesting, and then goes on to have a drink with Chips Lovell and then meet Hugh Morland for dinner. He discovers to his surprise that Hugh Morland is now in a relationship with Mrs. McClintock, and then is further surprised when his sister-in-law Priscilla, who is also Chip's wife, turns up with her boyfriend Odo Stevens. And Odo insists that they join Nick and Hugh and Mrs. McClintock, which Priscilla finds quite awkward. Priscilla goes off in a huff and Nick goes back to Hugh and Mrs. McClintock's house and discovers when there that the place where Chips Lovell had gone on to after seeing them has been blown up in the Blitz and that Chips Lovell has died. He tries to get in touch with Priscilla to tell her Priscilla is staying at Lady Molly's, who we've met before, but he can't get through on the phone, so he goes round to the house and finds that that house too has been bombed and Priscilla, like Chips, has died that night in the Blitz. In the third chapter, Nick is back at work and he gets a phone call from Charles Stringham to say that Charles has stumbled across Bithell and Bithell is very drunk and Charles needs some help getting him home. So Nick goes to help Charles get Bithell drunkenly home. And then they run into Widmerpool, who is quite angry. Widmerpool is very displeased to find Bithell drunk, and after that he does his best to get Bithell fired. He's also previously done his best to transfer Stringham away from somewhere where Widmerpool himself was working, which Nick is not very pleased with, as it's a position which may mean that Stringham is going to be sent abroad and maybe put in more danger. Widmerpool announces at the end of this that he is in fact going to be promoted and is going to be leaving where he is currently. We also again encounter Sunny Fairbrother, who we haven't met since the first book, who is also getting promoted and comes to tell Widmerpool. So Nick is called on to a new post and we end the book by learning that Barnaby has also died in the war. So, things I love about this book. There are a lot. This is one of my favourites. It's definitely my favourite, I think, of the 3 books that take place during the war, although I say that I don't remember the Military Philosophers that well, so I might change my mind when I read the next one. But I think there are some wonderful bits in this book, especially in the way that it looks at the Second World War, both in terms of kind of being part of the army, as Nick is kind of exploring that aspect of World War II in the first and third chapters of this book, but also that middle chapter when he's on leave, exploring the horrors of the Blitz and the very suddenness of death. Like, that's one of the most powerful things in this book, is that he's literally talking to Chips and Priscilla and then sort of 3 hours later they're gone and that's it. I think it's so powerful, and so I also love that Stringham is back in this book. Stringham is one of my favourite characters. He's possibly my favourite character in the series and I always love it when he turns up. And I knew that he turned up in one of the books in the war, but I couldn't remember which one it was, so I was kind of waiting throughout the last book and then this, and I was very pleased to find him turn up again. One of the things I love about this book, like I love about the whole series, is the blend of humour and darkness. Obviously this is an incredibly grim book in many ways. A lot of characters, 4 important characters who we've known well throughout the series so far, all die in this book. Barnaby, Chips, Priscilla and Lady Molly. They're all gone very quickly and their deaths are very sudden, as is the suicide of Biggs, one of the officers who Nick works with. But at the same time as all that darkness and horror, there are also moments of great humour in this. The fact that Stringham and Nick have to try and put Bithell to bed when he is so drunk, mirroring when Nick and Widmerpool many books ago put Stringham to bed when he was drunk. It's really, really well done. Also, just whenever Charles Stringham turns up, he's so funny as a character and so interesting. I just love it. I think it's brilliant. The one thing I say that I not exactly like less about this book, but I find the Second World War books hard to follow in some ways, not in terms of any of the social interaction and the character relationships going on, but the actual like what Nick does and what the war is doing and what all the different officer ranks mean, I really don't know. Somewhere, I think probably at my parents' house, I have a non-fiction book called Invitation to the Dance, which is like a companion non-fiction book to the series A Dance in Musical Time, which like has like long lists of characters and explains lots of stuff. And I think that would be really useful to clear up some of my vagueness about what's going on work-wise in terms of Nick's work and career in some of the war books. But I also don't want to look at it until I've finished rereading the whole series, because I think there will be a lot of spoilers for things that happen later on in the series. And obviously I have read it before, but actually it was so long ago I don't remember that well. I kind of want to experience it fairly fresh as I'm going through it, which I have been so far. Some bits I've remembered really well, then others I had completely forgotten. A few characters I want to talk about before we get into discussing the themes, which I think is what I want to talk about most in here. I want to talk about Widmerpool, of course, because this book is another that's quite focused on him. It's interesting, I think in many ways you can view the series as a kind of battle, in a way, of different ways of viewing the world between Nick and Widmerpool. They view the world in very, very different ways, and they are two incredibly central characters. Widmerpool is in many ways the other focal point of the series, apart from Nick. Stringham, I think, is a third character who is also really, really important to the series, but Widmerpool and Nick, I think, in many ways are the two main characters, and they obviously have completely different ways of looking at the world, which I find really interesting, even if you can just see in the attitude they take towards Stringham is so different, and Nick has such a fondness for Stringham, whereas for Widmerpool, he could only possibly be a source of embarrassment. Also, the way that Widmerpool and Nick view the army in very, very different ways. Nick is keen to have an interesting job and to be part of it, but he's not an incredibly efficient, brilliant person, whereas Widmerpool thinks very, very highly of his own work and is very determined to be promoted, but he's also quite ruthless and sometimes dodgy in the way that he goes about things. He gets in trouble for putting forward one of his own men for a particular role and kind of spreading the wrong rumours about the wrong kind of people. He gets in quite a lot of trouble at the end of the book for this, so even in the sense that it might slightly spoil his prospects. There is a suggestion that Widmerpool, while he has flourished in civilian life working in the city, and while he is also in many ways in his element in military life and does really well, he also doesn't completely understand how the military works in the same way as someone like Sonny Fairbrother does, and he still has kind of a lot to learn. I also want to talk a bit about Stringham here. I think it's interesting to see how much Stringham has changed and how much at the same time he has not changed. It's so sad, I find, Stringham's plotline in A Dance in Musical Time, but especially that moment where he sees Nick, and it takes Nick a moment to recognise him because he kind of looks so ill and pale. The fact that Nick sees Stringham and recognises him, but because of their difference in rank, it's very hard for them to acknowledge that they know each other. They were best friends when they were at school. But when Nick asks Stringham if he will dine with him and be friends with him, Stringham says, "No, I'm a private, you're an officer, I think it would be awkward now." I find that really, really sad. And also the way that the officers treat Stringham is just really horrible. They're so mean to him, and especially because of the fact that he talks in an upper class way and they think, you know, he's beneath that, he has no right to speak in that way. That's his social class and his background, but because of his rank they make fun of him for the fact that he talks that way, because a private has no business to talk about having been to the Ritz, which Stringham has, and they don't believe he has, and they think it's all put on, because I think it's quite telling about the Second World War, and it's also just really, really sad. Similarly, the fact that when Nick tries to persuade Stringham that he ought to try and get transferred and to get out of going to the Middle East because of his health, Stringham says no, because actually Stringham is unhappy and he doesn't care very much for his life. He thinks that being killed might be glamorous, and he just wants something to live for and something to be good at, and therefore he decides to stay with the mobile laundry and go to the Middle East if it comes to that. I'm not going to spend too long on characterization today, as there aren't very many new characters in this book, and there's quite a lot of short bits with lots of different characters rather than focuses on particular characters apart from Stringham and Widmerpool. But I do want to talk about Nick a bit before we move on. I think it's interesting how, although he is a observer and in some places is absent from the story, you do get a strong sense of what he's like as a person, especially when you see him in contrast to other characters, especially when you see him in contrast to Widmerpool. Working for him, you see how Widmerpool cares so much about efficiency and work and kind of getting to the top, whereas Nick cares much more about people. His attitudes towards Stringham is very, very different to Widmerpool, and he is absolutely disgusted when he realises that Widmerpool may have sent Stringham into danger in order just to take Stringham away from him, in order to kind of lessen any embarrassment Widmerpool might feel of the fact that he went to school with Stringham. And we also, I think, do get a sense in this book of Nick's real grief life as the war goes on and he begins to lose people. One of my favourite moments in this book is when he goes to Lady Molly's and discovers that Lady Molly and Priscilla has died, and he has that conversation with Eleanor Walpole Wilson in which both of them are just a bit like broken about what has happened and how awful it is. But you do get a sense that Nick is struggling with everything that is happening around him, and even though Nick as a narrator doesn't describe his own feelings in great detail, I think you do get such a sense of it. So I think that's mostly what I want to say on characterization. Let's talk about a few themes before I wrap up the video. One important theme, which I've kind of touched on a bit in characterization, is the kind of Nick versus Widmerpool theme, which is a kind of theme throughout the series, the very, very different ways in which they approach life. I've already touched on this quite a bit, but it's very, very interesting to see the very, very different ways they look at the war and they look at the people around them and they view themselves in relationship to other people. Nick is someone who is characterized by the way he regards other people, by his relationships to other people and his observations of other people, whereas Widmerpool is solely focused on himself. Another interesting theme in this is kind of career progression and army life. There is a lot in here about kind of career progression and promotions and trying to get different jobs and the difficulty of getting on in the army and the difficulties especially of being in your mid-30s, as Nick is, being not a very high-ranking officer and struggling to get interesting and useful work where you're really doing something. Like I said, the career progression, army stuff is something that I find slightly hard to follow in A Dance to the Musical Time, but I still find it really, really interesting, especially, you know, when Nick goes to that interview and his French just isn't good enough for him to get a more interesting job, and he fears for his job now that Widmerpool is going to be promoted and he doesn't really know where else he might end up. Another important theme, I think, in this is the kind of differences and contrast between civilian life and army life and between the pre-war and during the war. One of the most powerful things I think about that second chapter in this is how similar in some ways it is to early books in A Dance to the Musical Time. Nick goes to meet Chips for a drink and then he meets Hugh Morland and Mrs. McClintock. There's a slightly awkward moment with Odo Stevens and Priscilla. There are the usual kind of coincidences and complicated family and social and romantic relationships. People go out for drinks, people go out for dinner. He ends up going back to Morland and Mrs. McClintock's flat where he runs into Max Pilgrim, who we have encountered, but I'm not sure we've ever spoken to before in the Dance to the Musical Time. He turns up a lot being mentioned, but he's never really properly encountered. It reads in many ways like a section from one of the earlier books, and yet it's also a chapter that is full of death. By the end of that chapter, 3 important characters in the series have died. The kind of sociable pre-war atmosphere of his dinner with Hugh and Mrs. McClintock is just completely gone. Everything is so much more breakable and fleeting during the war. And throughout the book you see the kind of disturbing influence of war, how it affects people and makes people behave in different ways. Would Hugh Morland and Mrs. McClintock have gotten together if there hadn't been a war? Would Priscilla have left Chips for Odo? Would Biggs have hung himself? You see so clearly how war kind of disrupts and affects people's lives. And a very important theme in this novel is obviously death. It runs throughout the book and is incredibly important, especially in the way that it links in with time, which is obviously one of the most important themes in this book, because the deaths in this book all seem so sudden. Biggs hangs himself without warning. Nick spends time with Chips and Priscilla only a couple of hours before their death. Lady Molly, who is usually such a rich and full personality, is dead within minutes in her home. Impossibility and the awfulness of war, where someone is there and alive and talking and full with emotional complexity and worrying about their relationships and their future, like Chips and Priscilla are, and then a few hours later gone forever. It's so awful and it's so brilliantly and powerfully portrayed and so utterly sad. And then there are the last couple of paragraphs of the book. Nick is discussing with Soper Big's suicide. "Fine kettle of fish," he said. "Never thought Biggie would have done that. In the cricket pav of all places, and him so fond of the game. Worrying about that key did it, more than the wife business in my opinion. Quite a change it will be, not having him grousing about food every day." That same week the plane was shot down on which Barnaby was undertaking a reconnaissance flight with the aim of reporting on enemy camouflage. We haven't heard from Barnaby or about Barnaby for ages, and yet this final bleak statement moves from one scene to another to let us know that Barnaby has also died, that death is sort of that random during wartime. I think that's all I wanted to say. It's such an interesting and powerful book and definitely one of my favourites so far. I'm really looking forward to reading on with the rest of the series. Please let me know what you thought of The Soldier's Art, and hopefully the video on the military philosophers won't be too long before it's up. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.